Appreciate it. Yeah, absolutely. This is a talk that I've been putting together on some stuff that I've been interested in over the last couple of years. I generally focus on cybercrime. I'm more of a cybercrime researcher and focus on ransomware and my day job and that. But from studying, where these cybercriminals come from in Russia, and I kind of got a little bit more interested in some of the state-sponsored stuff, some of the disinformation-related stuff. So this is more of a passion project, really, than some of my formal research that I do for work. But it's all joined together. It's all cyber at the end of the day, right? So I'm going to be talking about Dezinformatsia, which is Russian espionage and Russian political warfare, basically, in the 2020s. But at the end of the day, to start off the talk, let's think about what information warfare and disinformation actually is. Basically, you want to generate a kind of a story and a narrative and put that in front of people and get them to think about it and influence their behaviors and decisions. That's one of the main reasons that states and entities actually perform these types of attacks against their adversaries, right? And in today's global landscape, we have, people from anywhere in the world, small towns and cities and things are influenced by things happening globally. So you may see, protests outside of your local town hall about stuff going on thousands of miles away in Israel and Gaza or in Ukraine or Taiwan or whatever. Whatever the day's topic is, people are already kind of riled up and protesting about it, even though it actually doesn't really impact them that much on a day-to-day basis, right? But that's, why these disinformation campaigns are so effective. And yeah, at the end of the day, you want to be able to influence your target's decision-making, and you put those messages out. That's the main reason why they do this. So let's think about the 4 Ds of Russian disinformation. What they do is they start with, by any time something sort of accuses Russia of something, or Russian people of something, or the oligarchs, or Putin himself, the first thing they're always going to do is they're going to dismiss it. They're going to say, no, it's not true, it's fake. Deny, deny, deny. It always works at the end of the day, because they never admitted it, right? Then they actually start to distort the truth. They start to come up with alternative narratives and say, well, we know it's not true. This is a potential reason of why something happened, right? They kind of twist the things and want to lead people down that path. And then they start to detract from it. They start to pick apart the opposition's arguments and what the opposition are trying to say, and basically discredit them. And eventually, at the final step, they'll start to dismay them. They'll start attacking the people that are making these accusations in the final step, really. This is kind of the traditional Russian disinformation playbook, right? And this is a cybersecurity conference, not a political or government sort of related conference. So we're going to be looking at a lot of offensive cyber operations and how cybersecurity and cyber attacks kind of fit into this whole larger, broader disinformation or political campaigns. And we're going to look at the three main agencies of Russia that actually perform these kinds of things. Have we got anyone here today that works for one of these agencies? I've got a couple of guys over there, so keep a lookout for those guys. And then we've also got the hacktivist groups. These are kinds of groups that you may have heard of in the news. Maybe some of your organizations have been targeted by them, or maybe you're working. Maybe you just like to hang out on Telegram and see the news pop up and things. So, these are kind of pro-Russia, patriotic hackers in a way, but most of the time they're going to be kind of state-encouraged, state-permitted, or maybe even just directly state-sponsored as well. And we've also got mercenaries. We've kind of got private companies running this kind of stuff as well. Companies based out of Moscow, St. Petersburg, that they kind of used to be an advertising agency, and now they've turned into spamming Facebook and Twitter with all sorts of fake ads and fake news articles and things as well. So the main theme of this talk is to think about what they're doing, what Russia's been doing in the 2020s. Let's take a little step back and look at what they did in the last decade. One of the main events really was 2014, the invasion of Crimea, the shooting down of MH17, the jet over Ukraine, by GRU operatives in eastern Ukraine. And the Russians trying to blame it on the Ukrainians and trying to scapegoat them into something that they did as well. And then we fast forward a little bit to 2017. You've got French election meddling. You've got campaigns in there trying to discredit the current French government and trying to push the right-wing party, Marine Le Pen and all that. And then we actually think back, fast forward to 2018, quite a lot going on, quite a busy year. We had the sarin gas attacks in Syria with al-Assad reportedly launching these chemical weapons against his own people, and then Russia was trying to push Russia Today and all these Russian news outlets were trying to blame the UN white helmets for it and saying it was an MI6 undercover operation or something like that. And then we also had the Sergei Skripal poisonings in Salisbury, just down the road. A couple of GRU guys came along and poisoned the defectors that are living in the UK, and all sorts of campaigns surrounded that as well. And then 2019, a very interesting campaign kind of started where they began to push anti-vaccination conspiracy theories, saying that vaccines caused all sorts of mental deficiencies in babies and all this kind of stuff. This was even way before COVID even kicked off. And it was causing protests and riots and things in Ukraine, even back then. So, and then thinking about, so kind of leading on to what's coming up in 2020, right? We could kind of see, this is the way things are going. The UK itself, we've actually had our fair share of Russian disinformation campaigns and intelligence-led, operations against us. 2014, the Scottish independence referendum, there was all sorts of Russian activity trying to, encourage people to vote to leave Scotland, trying to weaken the UK. That's sort of like that was Russia's interest in doing that. It's up to the Scottish people. At the end of the day, it was a vote for them, but the Russians were trying to encourage it for a reason, right? We had the 2016 Brexit referendum. Again, they were kind of successful in that because we did actually leave the EU. We had them trying to, discredit, politicians and people running the European Union. We had all sorts of manuals and trade deals and things. There's quite a big case of where Britain's trade deal with the US, a leak was made to Reddit. You had, a UK politician, Jeremy Corbyn, sharing these leaks. These are actually kind of taken and fished from politicians and leaked to Reddit intentionally by a Russian disinformation campaign. So they're kind of slowly, quietly influencing us without many of us realizing, right? And fast forwarding to the 2020s, what they're doing today. They've been, we had the COVID-19 pandemic. Everyone, we can all remember what that was like, and they were doing all sorts of things, trying to discredit, Western vaccines, or trying to blame the US for starting the pandemic. All this kind of stuff was going on. Not to say that the US wasn't doing their own disinformation campaigns, but just to be good to be aware of what the adversaries are doing as well, right? We had the end of 2020 was the US presidential election. 2021, we had January 6th, right? We had all the kind of stop the steal, stop the vote, stop the just kind of discrediting democracy. That again was all boosted and perpetrated by a lot of Russia-linked disinformation campaigns. And in 2022 and 2023, obviously starting in February, we had the invasion of Ukraine. They've been very much focused and tied up in that for a long period of time. And that's where a lot of their focus has been. And this year it's basically the global election cycle as well as the US. We've got this 2024 is actually the record for the most number of democratic elections in history, really. So, we've had India, we've had France so far, UK, Keir Starmer won, as some of us are aware. And then the big one really at the end of the year is the US election. So do be prepared to see a lot of ramping up of targeting, intrusions, big breaches, this kind of stuff going on, because it's within their interest to do so. Let's think back to how cyber attacks and cyber intrusions have supported their campaigns in the last decade. In 2014, we saw a very big, impactful attack targeting the Ukrainian presidential election. We had the actual election systems that count the votes back in 2014 was breached by the Russian intelligence, and they actually tried to influence and recount the numbers. And then on the day that the president was being called, they actually, on Russian media, they actually named a different guy who actually won. So everyone in Ukraine was confused of why the Russians were saying that this character won, when actually, the person who actually won was different. Fortunately, the Ukrainians caught this one, but, this is exactly the type of thing they're trying to do to democratic institutions and countries around the world, right? We saw this again in 2016. They tried to go for the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, the actual party that run, the Democrats. We had a breach by the GRU and the SVR. also known as Fancy Bear and Cozy Bear. And then we also had the breach of the World Anti-Doping Agency as well, so WADA. This was around the same time that Russia was about to be banned from participating in the Olympics. So they decided to basically breach that organization, WADA, to basically discredit athletes from other countries as well. The US and the UK had their medical records leaked as well. It's kind of revenge or whatever you want to call it, really, just to try and... They always like to do this thing where they try to level the playing field and accuse others of it. It's like when I come back to the beginning of the talk, when I was talking about how they deny, they distract, they dismay, all this kind of stuff. That's exactly part of this playbook. And it's the same with where they went after the OPCW. Their ally, Syria, was being accused of this chemical weapons attack, so they actually went after the investigating organization that was basically looking into this chemical weapons attack, and they stole a load of documents and began to leak them, and all this kind of like whataboutism, saying, look at these, look at what these other countries are doing. It's not, it's not so bad. And let's think about so that was last decade. What are they actually doing in the 2020s so far? We're nearly halfway through. We're at the sort of the middle of the 2024 rate. So let's actually try and think about what they're going to do in the next 5 years as well. So far, they've been very, very heavily focused on Ukraine. They've been very focused on the US and NATO. These are the three institutions that they want to basically spend most of their time targeting and bringing it down. And ever since the kind of beginning of the war in Ukraine in 2022, we've seen a lot more hacktivism, a lot more how pro-Russian hacktivist groups are getting involved with DDoS attacks and all sorts of things, which I'm going to get into more later. But it's been very interesting to see how this component has been really a big part of their modern-day current operations. A lot to do with Telegram, which, as we know, is a Russian-controlled social media platform. Another interesting thing to keep an eye on, I've only got one slide on this really, but the Russian activity in Africa. Many of us may we may dismiss this as maybe we don't have too much of a focus or interest in what's going on in Africa, but the Russians absolutely do. Some of you may be unaware, but we actually send a lot of foreign aid to Africa, right? We send the US and other Western countries. We've sent up to $100 billion US dollars in aid and sending vaccines and things. And the Russians have been absolutely discrediting that and spreading all sorts of conspiracy theories. And all that money's basically just going up in smoke because the people on the ground, people in the continent in Africa, are just not. They basically distrust Western pharmaceutical companies now. So all that money's wasted, and that's the power of disinformation and things as well. So now I'm going to talk about what all the different groups are doing. I mentioned about the GRU and the SVR and the FSB. I'm going to talk a little bit about what each group has been doing, just to kind of get a sense of how these operations work and how these different entities interact with these things. You can't teach an old worm new tricks, so Sandworm is a GRU-based APT group, Advanced Persistent Threat Group. They've been around, as long as cyber's been around recently. Basically, they've been launching DDoS attacks against Georgia back in the day. But they're most well known for NotPetya, InDestroyer 1 and 2, the Olympic Destroyer, big destructive cyber attacks that if you ever want to think about how one country may launch basically launch cyber warfare, this is your unit that does it. They've been very interesting related to participating in disinformation campaigns, as well as doing typical destructive GRU things. They've also kind of taken on things such as posing as Anonymous Poland or creating personas such as Guccifer 2.0. Sandworm and APT28 Fancy Bear have kind of been working together, spear phishing, leaking documents, and more recently they've been creating these hacktivist Telegram personas, which has been very interesting. We'll talk a bit more about those in a bit as well. The Cyber Army of Russia Reborn. Anyone here put your hand up if you've heard of these guys? One or two. This is a really interesting one of these hacktivist personas on Telegram that I've been talking about because they have been one of the groups that are launching these destructive attacks and then announcing them on Telegram. So, for one example, they were targeting the industrial control systems of water and waste management plants in the US. posting that video of them interacting with the human-machine interface, turning things off, turning up the temperature or whatever, causing things to shut down, and posting a video of them doing it and claiming responsibility for it. These aren't like huge, cities and things. We're not talking about going after New York or LA or something like that, but these are cities and municipalities in the US. So we're kind of seeing, GRU operations posing as hacktivists, using destructive attacks on the US and claiming it publicly. This is kind of a pretty big evolution of attacks, right? We haven't really seen this before until this year. This is a pretty interesting operation that we're, almost is kind of I kind of predict this is going to be the new normal. We're going to see a lot more of these destructive attacks claimed by activist groups, and Russia's just kind of going to be like, well, it's patriotic hackers. We can't control them. They have free will. They can do what they want, right? Another example is how another GRU-linked group was actually using cybercrime forums as a front to launch a kind of sort of chaos and spread around a data leak on some of those forums. It was kind of in conjunction with, at the start of the war in January 2022, we had a load of destructive attacks to target the Ukrainian government entities. Those government websites had defacement pages posted up on them. They were like, some of them are written in Polish and Romanian and Russian, and basically again trying to obfuscate where the origin of it was, but at the end of the day it's not too hard to figure out, because they then went on to take those defacements and then they created a persona on the cybercrime forum called Raid Forums, and they were posting adverts to sell data they got from leaked stuff from databases and things from Ukrainian government services, and nothing else. This threat actor had no history of doing anything else before. They were basically an invented persona just for this operation, right? Definitely smells of kind of state-related activity to me. And this was kind of proven because the US Department of State put out basically a reward for justice. If you have $5 million, you can get $5 million if you provide them with information about this chap called Ammon Stegal, who is related to this campaign. He's a GRU-related threat actor who basically perpetrated this, is what they say. Another threat group that's been heavily targeting on the UK, US, and various institutions and universities and academics, think tanks and researchers and things, universities. So if you are part of one of these organizations, this is definitely the type of threat actor you should be worried about, because they do pretty basic phishing attacks, but it's very highly targeted. They craft these things, they think about the individual, they go after their personal email addresses, because most of the corporate stuff is going to be detected by an email gateway, right? But it's not too hard to figure out what their personal address in many cases is. They often invent personas. They often use like a multi-persona approach to go after their target, where they have a conversation between each other in an email thread, and then they bring in their target into that conversation. They send them a PDF with a link. A lot of times it's going to be like it's going to be like a conference invite. So if anyone here got an email saying to come to this conference, double check that. Make sure the sender address wasn't like .ru or something. With this group, what their aim is to get into your email inbox and then download all that data, and then sometimes they use it to launching for follow-up attacks against your network of individuals, your network of contacts, impersonate you, send emails to them. Eventually they get into their ultimate target, and then they actually will then steal that information, use it for political intelligence, that kind of stuff, espionage. And in the other cases, they have also used it for sort of created a leak site. They actually created a leak site called something like a very British coup, and it was all to do about the Brexit campaign, how it's failed, how there was a group of UK politicians and senior intelligence officials that wanted to hijack the government and do Brexit properly or something like that. It's just a classic, kind of made up conspiracy theory pushed by Russian disinformation campaigns as usual. Ghostwriter. This is another interesting group. Allegedly, they're part of the Belarusian KGB, which is interesting because Belarus has kind of become this little vassal state next to Russia and just doing everything they say. But they are actually known for launching their own campaigns, and they have actually been sort of intelligence and espionage campaigns coming out of Belarus, which has been pretty interesting to track. And they're quite unique. What they actually like to do is break into the web panels of websites, especially particularly news websites, and then they will actually publish their own articles using the trust that that news website has established. They mostly target like Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland, and then push sort of anti-NATO, anti-US kind of articles and things and say that they're getting them to recruit people to fight in the war in Ukraine or whatever, generate some of that resentment towards the West. But it's a particularly interesting campaign of how they do that, right? There's also been examples of where Belarusian TV, like the general news broadcasts, will actually cite the Telegram channel where the leaks are coming from this group. So you've got the state-sponsored news shows citing these Telegram things, these Telegram posts as the source. So it's kind of interesting how the intelligence services, these invented personas, and these things, and the actual news organizations all working together. So coming back to DDoS, probably some of you have read about the news with these DDoS attacks. Quite notable ones was Microsoft and OpenAI, Netflix, Twitter. They've all been DDoS offline for a certain period of time. And if you actually look on Telegram and look at some of these claims and things, you'll hear about how they took down this massive company's website. It's all over the news on Bleeping Computer and whatever. They only did it for maybe 5, 10 minutes, 15 minutes tops. But again, makes headline news. BBC's on about it. It's on the TV news as well. But all they did was really a small DDoS attack. But it's not like it's more like kind of graffiti. It's kind of a vandalism, but it still has the effect on the population, right? That this massive cyber attack has happened. They don't really know what cyber attack is, but they still feel like they're being attacked, and the government's doing something wrong, or the threats out there, and we shouldn't worry, that kind of stuff. It's pretty interesting to look into how what actually triggers these groups to launch these attacks, and what did that country or what did that target do to attract the attention of these DDoS groups? Did that company say something about Russia? Did they recently disconnect Russia from the cloud, which Microsoft just did? Microsoft was recently breached by the SVR, a Midnight Blizzard threat group, a couple of weeks before they actually disconnected Russian companies and things from M365. Maybe there's a correlation there, right? Same thing with these DDoS groups and things. So a recent example was in Romania. They, last couple of weeks, these groups have begun targeting Romanian government websites, portals, civil services, just generating general chaos for that country. Only after Romania claimed to share the Patriot air defense missile system with Ukraine. Right, so there's certain things that countries do that then suddenly attracts all these DDoS groups to come after them. Another way that government state-sponsored groups use is that they use DDoS groups to silence the Kremlin's critics. They will actually, there's got these independent media outlets that are from articles written by Russian citizens and things, but that are critical of the Russian government. Whenever they post something, they suddenly get a huge wave of DDoS attacks attacking their website. We can probably guess and figure out who's doing that. But another interesting thing that they'll do is some of these websites, they survive on their donations, so things like Patreon or PayPal or whatever. Medusa actually came out and said that their donation subscription website or the donation platform recently terminated their account because the bank said that stolen credit cards were being used to donate to them, and eventually just terminated their whole account. So they're coming up with all sorts of tactics to silence people. If we think back to 2010s, what were some of the things that they were going after? They were depicting Ukraine as corrupt. They were basically discrediting NATO, the EU, all this kind of alliances and things that kind of cut Russia out of it. They very much don't like that, and that's the types of organizations they're going after. Doppelganger is another interesting disinformation campaign. This is where, when you actually think about more sort of traditional disinformation campaigns, social media botnets, this kind of stuff, and including of the generation of websites, fake news articles, spreading to people on social media, getting them to share it as well, and getting them to believe these kind of conspiracy theories and fake news articles. One of the ways that Doppelganger was doing this was they would register a domain and clone the website of trusted news companies. So you've got The Guardian, even NATO's website itself. They would clone the website, push sort of a fake press release, and see those getting spread around as well. Pretty interesting tactic, pretty effective. Another interesting thing to note here is that Doppelganger was actually connected to a Moscow-based advertising company called Argonne Labs. There's a really interesting research report out there if you want to go and figure out how they actually made those connections. But again, it kind of comes back to my point of how these mercenaries, these private companies, are getting involved in sort of what the Russian government is up to these days. Another example of hijacking trust. You've got these fake videos pretending to be from the BBC, citing Bellingcat as a source. Anyone here heard of Bellingcat at all? I see some heads nodding and hands up. Definitely anti-Russian researchers that figure out how the GRU and how the FSB are launching these kind of large, broader campaigns, the poisonings and things in Salisbury or the shooting down of MH17. They kind of figure these things out through research and connecting identities together, publish these reports, and the Kremlin does not like that at all. So they've kind of built up, among us, everyone in this room, if we read something about Bellingcat, we're generally going to believe it because we think those researchers are credible, right? So that's the kind of thing they're hijacking. You should all be aware of it. When you're reading sort of outrageous claims and you see these claims are coming from someone, what is actually, has that organization actually officially said that and linked it themselves, right? Because anyone could just say, this guy said it, but did the guy actually say it, right? Another interesting way that they did that was they had these Instagram and TikTok videos where they would actually, there's a platform called Cameo where you can pay a celebrity, $50, $100, get them to say whatever they want, get them to say whatever you want, and then they record it, add these kind of captions and things to it, and they share it around on social media. And a lot of it was about anti-Ukraine, Zelensky super corrupt, all this kind of stuff that you can probably imagine. But interesting tactic, hijacking the kind of reputation that these celebrities have. Their fans, if they hear them saying it, they kind of generally believe it, right? That's kind of how these things work, even if it's just subconsciously as well. Very, very recently, I think last week, the FBI and the Department of Justice put out this advisory with the Dutch authorities as well, Dutch intelligence. They actually managed to find a social media botnet that has been enhanced with AI. AI is definitely, buzzword, keyword of the year. But this was pretty interesting how they were doing this one, because what they did was they were generating sock puppet accounts, personas, using AI-generated images and AI-generated text, and they were getting them to reply to conversations on social media, on Twitter, formerly Twitter, now known as X, but they were replying to US politicians with sort of deepfake videos as well. So there's all sorts of ways they're leveraging deepfakes and AI and generation and things. And they just had an entire platform to do this automatically for them. They just click a few buttons, these things are created, and they just start spinning up their conspiracy theory stuff. So pretty interesting, pretty difficult to stop, because imagine each one, you have to try and break it down and discredit those claims and prove that they're wrong. You can't really keep up with the amount of fakes that are coming out with stuff like this, right? Something a little bit different, not 100% cyber, but satellite signal hijacking. Has anyone here heard or seen or had their TVs hijacked recently to play the Russian Victory Day parades? Basically, in May, around the time of the Russian Victory Day parades and things, they decided to overpower all the TV broadcasting stations and play the actual parades that are going on, like Moscow and Red Square in front of the Kremlin. Decided to basically overpower the legitimate TV signals and play that instead, which is pretty interesting because the way satellite communications work is whoever has the biggest signal wins. So maybe this is the kind of thing we might see in the future more. This is the kind of, if they're willing to do this against international targets outside of Ukraine, what else are they really willing to do, right? You've got the Paris Olympics, 2024 Paris Olympics coming up. Maybe this is kind of rehearsal for something they're going to pull in that. who knows? They've been going on about how they're going to target it, and we may see something like this, right? So if you're involved in that, be prepared, is all I can say. This is a really interesting one as well, is Russia's crypto thugs for hire. So the way that the GRU's been operating recently, you may have heard about men being arrested for arson and physical violence and things against all sorts of companies in different countries. Well, some researchers at the Insider managed to figure out that they have actually been contacting criminals over Telegram, paying them 400 to 2,000 euros in Ethereum, and getting them to basically carry out attacks of violence. So maybe in the cybercrime underground, you've heard of like violence as a service. You can pay someone $100, $1,000 to throw a brick through someone's window. It's kind of like that, but on a state-sponsored terrorism level. It's a pretty concerning trend, which we may see more of in the future because of how simple it is to scale up, right? Anyone from any country can now pay someone to do terrorist attacks for them, semi-anonymously, right? Pretty interesting, scary stuff. So what actually happens in Russia? This is kind of like where this talk takes a little bit of a detour from the campaigns that they're doing against the rest of the world. But how do they protect themselves from those campaigns against them? Well, you have two main organizations that kind of do that. You've got Roskomnadzor, am I saying that right? Roskomnadzor, and then you've also got the FSB as well. They're kind of part of the Ministry of Communications, and you've got the Federal Security Service as well. Very much sort of technological organizations. They monitor telecommunications, they monitor social media, they monitor just general internet traffic as well. And the way they do that is through one of the things that the FSB does is they have kind of these little black boxes that go into the telecoms companies, force them to install them, and if they don't, they get fined or the CEO gets arrested or something. You don't really have a choice in this kind of stuff, right? And then one of the ways that Roskomnadzor does it is they issue fines, they arrest people, and they also push false narratives and fake press releases and go on Russia Today and have an interview and just spew a load of nonsense, really. Another interesting thing is what the law enforcement and court systems do. They actually basically outsource some of their research to de-anonymizing people to these platforms. So maybe if you work in cybersecurity, if you work in threat intel, you may use something like Recorded Future or Maltego. There's kind of like these Russian versions of it. So you've got something called Insider, the Insider platform for Telegram, and you've got Laplace's Daemon as well. And these basically are de-anonymization tools. They're plugged into all of the data breaches and OSINT tools related to the Russian platforms, such as you've got Telegram, vContact, and LiveJournal and things as well, right? They're pretty interesting. And sometimes you'll actually see these screenshots from these platforms appear in court documents as well. Pretty interesting to me. And how does Russia protect its citizens from, foreign states and foreign disinformation campaigns against them? Well, what they've recently been doing is basically banning all Western social media in a way. They create some Russian developers who used to write Wikipedia in Russian. They basically split off from the official Wikipedia and created their own one called RuWiki. Basically the first thing they did was go back and censor all of the things to do with, World War II and Stalin executing people, all sorts of crazy stuff really, and just rewriting history, and then banning the original Wikipedia. Recently, last week or a couple of weeks ago, YouTube has been banned as well and throttled in Russia, and they've created their own version. A company associated with Russia Today created their own version called Platformer. And then you've also got recent bans of VPNs and VoIP as well. So you can no longer connect outside of Russia, really, and visit the foreign websites. So they're basically turning into North Korea. And Putin was just there in North Korea, so maybe he got a few ideas, right? Lots of interesting stuff. So what does the Kremlin say that they do this? They do this to stop the spread of misinformation. They do it to stop the spread of fraud, they say, some of the justifications of this. And they also say to stop the spread of harmful content, like such as things as drugs and CSAM. Just kind of like typical scaremongering, typical gaslighting. But the real reality that I believe, my assessment is that it's just to monitor people, to stop them thinking independently, and just to keep going and keep maintaining control over the population. So in conclusion, disinformation is part of Russia's broader strategy. Everything they do is kind of tied into it in some way. Remember the 4Ds whenever you're thinking about news related to Russia. And just, think about how effective it's been. They can undermine democracies, they can sway elections, they can cause people to launch physical assaults and violence just by sending them cryptocurrency over Telegram. Right? It's pretty dangerous times ahead. If you're interested in learning more about some of the stuff, where I got some of this stuff and things I've been interested in recently, I've got a whole list of reports here as well. Just pause if anyone wants to take a picture. But yeah, lots of interesting stuff out there, and this threat is definitely not going away, and helps explain why they do some of the cyber attacks they do, right? Thanks very much.